Well, as we begin this morning, I need to admit that this message will be a little bit unusual. It'll be a little bit different in that we are going to be talking about one topic in order to talk about another topic. We will be talking about one thing to talk about something else. In a sense, you could put it this way, there will be two sermons smashed together this morning, or if you want to be a little bit more positive about it, it is buy one, get one free. Nevertheless, bear with me as we talk of one matter in order to talk about something else. One subject to talk about a subject of even greater value. And the topic I want to begin with, the subject that we will lead off with this morning is marriage. Marriage, which is an absolutely essential and critical topic in our time given our circumstances and situation. Marriage is under attack. It doesn't take much to see this. We can observe it in the recent Supreme Court decision of Obergefell, in that the Supreme Court, and really the United States as a society, in attempting to redefine marriage, has really tried to rid themselves of the institution that God established at creation. And so marriage is under attack. But if you want to be technical, marriage was not just under attack now, it has been under attack before. We could point to the laws on divorce as a compromise and a tarnishing of marriage's longevity, of its endurance, of its uniqueness thereby. And so marriage has been under attack. And we could also point out that the rise of feminism has assaulted marriage because it has assaulted its roles, the God-ordained roles of husband and wife. That has been under siege by the rise of feminism. And so marriage has been and is under attack. However, if we're still to be technical, marriage has been under attack far longer than the United States has ever been around. We could go back to the days of Solomon, where there were at least 1,000 ways marriage was under attack. We could go back to Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. Marriage is under attack then. And in Genesis chapter 4, marriage has been under attack. It is interesting that in Genesis chapter 4, Adam knows his wife. Cain even knows his wife. But Lamech, the text says, it does not mention that he knows his wives, quote unquote. That's important because already Moses is alerting us that marriage, that knowing, that covenantal relationship happens between man and wife. And so polygamy is against God's ordained order, and Moses already indicates that in the text of Genesis 4. And with that, we see essentially that marriage has been under attack from the moment of the fall. The fall happens in Genesis 3, and in Genesis 4, it is attacked. What does that reflect? It reflects man's deep-seated depravity, that he would oppose God on the most fundamental, foundational level of the way God instituted society to be in marriage. That is how far man's depravity will go. It will oppose God on every level, including the core level, and so marriage has been under attack, and that reflects the deep-seated rebellion and evil within man. Now, having said this, don't be discouraged. I would not be discouraged by the quote-unquote developments, really a downward spiral that has taken place. It is actually a tremendous opportunity. A tremendous opportunity. Because the restraint has been loosened, because people are less restrained, now they are asking out front what has always been in their heart, namely, what's so special about marriage? What's so important about marriage? And such skepticism makes the uniqueness of true marriage, that is Christian marriage, it makes it unique. It makes it stand out clearer by contrast. By contrast, our stance in marriage and on marriage and our very marriages themselves will be more forceful, and they will have a greater impact on society because of the contrast that is happening now in society. This has generated a massive opportunity for witness. Our witness has become easier. Because by living faithfully according to God's word and articulating God's word, we stand out all the more. And the beauty of marriage in its theological value is bolder in its proclamation. For that very reason, we should not be discouraged, and we should be even thankful that God has made witnessing easier. And for that same reason, we then need to understand and be able to answer the question, what is so special about marriage? What's so important about marriage? To the world, Christianity and God appear to be a giant killjoy because we put so many limitations and restrictions on quote-unquote love. To the world, Christianity and God are clueless about love. We have a very low view of love according to the world because we're just so restrictive and we put so many rules on love. Love should be freer. That's the American way anyways. And so, what's so special about love? What's so special about marital love? How do we respond to these kinds of allegations? Is God really clueless about love? All of this demands that we understand and comprehend a theology of marriage. Not just that it is between a man and a wife for life, but why that is the case. The so what of that, the significance of that. And I'd like to walk us through several points of a theology of marriage this morning. Several points of a theology of marriage this morning. First of all, marriage is reflective of divine love. Marriage is reflective of divine love. That is triune love. We see this at the very beginning. In Genesis 1, the Lord says, "Let us make man in our image." With the language of us and our, the triune Godhead is speaking, and his image bearing in man is seen reflecting triune relationships. In fact, that is codified in the next verse. God says, and God does create man, it says, male and female, he created them. And so the relationship between man and woman in marriage is reflective of the love that the Godhead shares. This unifying, mysterious, ultimate love that God has is mirrored in the oneness in marriage. Along that very line, and confirming that at the end of Genesis 2, we see this because the two become one flesh. The two become one flesh. It is fascinating. And the closest grammatical parallel to Genesis chapter 2, that very verse, is Deuteronomy 6:4. I think we're very familiar with this verse. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Or an alternative translation might be, "The Lord our God is one Yahweh." One God, one Yahweh, just like there is one flesh. The way marriage works is intention to mirror the unifying, intimate love, the original and ultimate love of the triune God. You could think of it this way. You cannot explain the existence of love apart from the Trinity. You cannot explain the existence of love apart from the Trinity. If you believe in evolution and thereby natural selection, it is going to be impossible for you to account for a selfless love when your entire system operates based on selfishness. It's not going to be, you cannot account for love. And if you're a pure monotheist, you don't believe in the persons of the Trinity, well then who's God going to love? There's no one else but him. So you cannot have love. And if you're a polytheist or any variation of the type, many gods, then you do not have love in the way that we want to conceive love, which is this unifying love that brings people or gods or whatnot together. It's not possible because they are separate with their own definitions and they vie for the definition of love. They are not brought together. The only way you can have the love that we understand is true love is via the triune God, where there are three persons, yet they are one. They are one in essence. And it is for this very reason that God ordains marriage between man and woman, demonstrating distinct persons becoming one. This is the logic in Leviticus 18 against incest and homosexuality. In Leviticus 18, it says, relative to incest, that incest is wrong because in the Hebrew it talks of one flesh becoming one flesh. A near relative, someone of the remnant of flesh, joining with the same flesh. That's not two becoming one flesh. That's one flesh becoming one flesh. That's why it's wrong. It does not mirror Trinitarian love. It does not mirror triune original love. Similarly, this is why homosexuality is wrong, because you don't have distinct persons becoming one. You have a similar person becoming one with a similar person. This is why homosexuality is wrong. Marriage, by God's design, in the persons that are involved, husband and wife, reflect how in the Godhead there are distinct persons who become one. This has been God's design all along. And so marriage reflects, it mirrors divine love. The triune love, the most mysterious, ultimate, original, highest love. Marriage is very profound. Marriage by design is very profound. Along that line, it's not just the divine love that marriage has, it is a driving love. A driving love. That is what it also demonstrates. We see in books like Hosea and Ephesians that God's love for his people is made analogous with marriage because there is a fidelity that God has to his people. He always keeps his promises, and that drives history and God's promises and his plan forward to its consummation. God will never give up on his people. He will never renege on his guarantees because he is faithful and he loves his people. And so the faithfulness and fidelity within marriage reflects God's own faithfulness that shapes history. And for that very reason, it is not just a divine love or a driving love, it is also a delivering love. We see this at every stage of God's deliverance. Marriage, in the analogy of marriage, is involved. For instance, in the Godhead, in 1 Corinthians 11, it says that God the Father is the head of Christ. And for that reason, husbands are the head of their spouses, their wives. The way that the son submits to his father relative to redemption is mirrored out in the way that a wife submits to her husband. It is mirroring the love that initiates redemption in the Godhead. But marriage doesn't just mirror the love that initiates deliverance in the Godhead. It also mirrors it in how we receive that love. How we receive that love as believers. Ephesians chapter 5, husbands are to love their wives and wives are to honor their husbands. Why? Because this mirrors how Christ loved the church. And so how the love of God is initiated in the Godhead is reflected in marriage, and how we receive that love as believers is reflected in marriage, and in fact how that love is consummated is reflected in marriage. After all, in Revelation 19, the church is welcomed to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so from beginning to end, marriage is a reflection of the love of God driving all of history. It reflects his divine love, the triune love, and the unique persons involved. It reflects his driving love in his fidelity. It denotes a delivering love in the roles that men and women have in marriage. This is a love reflected in marriage that is beginning, middle, and end. And so marriage, in all of its components, by God's intentional design, is a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece of the full gamut and the full spectrum of the love of God. It is nothing short than art, as God brings together two sinners, makes them saints, brings the saints together in order to reenact and recapitulate the way they were saved in the first place. That is what is happening in marriage. That is what we do in marriage. And for this very reason, because marriage is so loaded with such a great theology, it exhibits this kind of gospel-centered love that God has and God acts. That's why we invest in our marriages. That's why it's worthwhile to do so, because there is so much there. Sometimes I ask the sheep of the flock, I say, how is your walk with the Lord? And I say, well, all I'm doing, I know it's not that big of a deal. I'm just working on my marriage. I know that's not grand. Not grand to show the ultimate highest form of triune love. Not grand to show a love that shapes all of history. Not grand to demonstrate the love that drives God's redemption forever. Not grand. Marriage is a big deal, and it's worthwhile to invest in it. It's worthwhile. And if you're single or if you're married, all of us can champion God's design of marriage. All of us can champion it. And when people say, oh, you Christians and your God, you have a low view of marriage. No, we tell them, no, you have a low view of marriage. You have a low view of love. Our view of love is the highest because it is eternal and it is redeeming and it is transforming and it changes history. Yours is fleeting and fleshly. It is lowly. Ours is the highest. That's why we are so insistent on our definition of marriage. We should invest in our marriages and we should champion marriage because we recognize that God has made marriage the highest form of human love. The highest form of human love. It is divine. It is driving. It is delivering. But it is one more thing. One more thing. One more component. Not just divine. Not just driving. Not just delivering. It is this as well. Deficient. Deficient. You say, what? That doesn't make any sense. You just said marriage and love and is the highest human expression. It reflects God himself and the triune mystery and all these kinds of things. Yes, but it is intentionally deficient. God has made it limited. And we can see that limitation in a famous phrase that we say all the time, till death do us part. That really is a biblical concept. It really is a biblical idea. For example, in the Old Testament law, the reason a widow can remarry and there is levirate marriage in the Old Testament is because the Bible understands when one dies, your marriage has ended. That is why it is not adultery to become remarried. Similarly, in Romans 7 and 1 Timothy 5, we have that same counsel and truth asserted. Why? Because the Bible recognizes when you die, when your spouse dies, the marriage has ended. In fact, the Lord Jesus Christ announces this himself. In Matthew 22, what does our Lord say? That people after death will be made like the angels, neither marrying or being given in marriage. Death does us part in that way. And so God allows us to behold and observe the beauty and passion and intensity, the intimacy, personalness, closeness, oneness, amazing and deep bond that is contained within marriage. We can observe it and see that marriage extends us to the very limit of what is humanly possible to love, so that in the end, God will say, as amazing and as expansive and as intense as all that is, my love is still more. He brings us to the very limit of what we can do to show his limitlessness. That is what marriage ultimately points to. It is intentionally deficient for that reason. And it is then God's love that I really want to talk about this morning. After all, I said we were going to talk about one topic to talk about another topic. One topic to talk about a greater topic. We talked about marriage in order to talk about the greater topic, which is God's love. And you could put it this way. Marriage, unlike marriage, where it is death does us part, the power and the beauty and the grandeur and the ultimate proof of the supremacy of God's love is that death shall never do us part. Death shall never do us part. And we learn this in Hosea chapter 13, verse 14. Turn there with me to Hosea chapter 13, verse 14. Hosea 13, verse 14. The text reads as such: Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, where is your sting? Nevertheless, compassion is hidden from my sight. We already know initially what this verse overall means. We know that this verse is talking about the resurrection. It is quoted, after all, in 1 Corinthians 15, and that is exactly what Paul is talking about in that text, and this text is no different. There is consistency between the two. This is dealing with the resurrection. But having said that, we don't always know why Hosea said this. So what? What's the significance? What's Hosea's intent? What is he trying to say through the resurrection? And to identify that, we need some context. We need some context. And so if we're thinking about Hosea as a book as a whole, we need to first understand, and this links to everything that we've been talking about, Hosea is a book about God's love, about God as a God of love. You see, in Hosea's day, people beginning to hear about God's judgment began to question, well, does God really love us then? Is he really a loving God? How can a God of love judge us? How can a God of love do this? Does God truly love us? And so God sends Hosea to prove to a doubting Israel that God truly is a God of love. And the way God does this is he proclaims to Israel, I have the highest love for you, the deepest love for you, the most intense and immense love for you. It can only be compared to the love of marriage, the highest form of human love. But you don't love me, Israel. You don't love me at all. In the context of marital love, their lack of love is nothing short of spiritual adultery. Spiritual adultery. So God commissions Hosea to marry Gomer the harlot, to show to Israel how deeply he loves them and how deeply they hate him. And because they hate him so, he will have to judge them. He will have to judge them. In Hosea 1-3, he explains the nature of that judgment. He is going to cause the nations to run away from Israel because they are so ashamed. And in their shame, he will draw them to himself. And in fact, in Hosea 1-2, it says this, that God will find Israel in the wilderness, and it will be just like as if they first met. They're going to return back to the good old days and beyond is the idea, because he will pursue them so. And with that, God teaches us a very important lesson. God's judgment is not in spite of his love. It's not even just because of his love. God's judgment is an act of his love. God's judgment is an act of his love. In Hosea, God's judgments are designed to bring his people to himself. They are designed to be part of his pursuit of his people. God's judgment is an act of love. His judgment actually proves he's a God who cares about his people because he's willing to do whatever it takes to bring them back to himself. And God will expound upon this throughout the rest of the book, and he will do so in two ways. In two ways, and really these two ways match with how you think about a marriage relationship. There is an internal level. That's the internal relationship between a husband and his wife. And there is also an external level. An external level, that is how one spouse treats everyone else on the outside in comparison with how they treat their spouse. Internal and external. Because if you stop and think about it, if there's an internal problem, a husband and wife don't have a good relationship, well, that's a problem. But there is also an equal problem if the spouse treats everyone else the same way and loves everyone else the same way as they love their spouse. We have a word for that. It's called adultery. Therefore, God examines Israel's relationship with him from the vantage point of internal and external to help them understand the dynamics of their relationship. And there's a pattern that emerges. Relative to the internal perspective, God says, Israel doesn't even know me. We can see that in chapter 4, verse 1, and again in chapter 4, verse 6. Israel has no knowledge of God. There is no covenant relationship. It's pretty bad when you don't even know your spouse. Can you imagine leading a counseling session for a married couple and they introduce themselves? One person says, hi, I'm so-and-so and I'm married to this person. And the other person says, really? I don't even know your name. You're a total stranger to me. We've been married for 20 years. I don't remember any of it. Sorry. That's when you know you have real problems. And that's God's relationship with Israel. Yahweh, Elohim, who's that? I don't know him. And God says, for this very reason, because your harlotry has reduced you to that level, Israel, you must be judged. You must be judged. The relationship will be cut off. And think about this with me. If and since God's law says there is only one punishment for adultery, and what is that punishment? Death, execution. Then if Israel, and since Israel has committed spiritual adultery, then they must what? Die. And so God says in chapter 5, verses 14 and 15, I will be a lion and I will tear you apart. To put the metaphor simply, I will kill you. I will kill you. I will destroy you. And so Israel is a harlot. She has committed infidelity, and God will execute her. That's on the internal level. And we can see this on the external level. On the external level, God says in chapter 7 that Israel's heart burns like a furnace, but it doesn't burn for God. It burns for everyone else. Israel loves everyone else as opposed to God. And God says, as a result of that, in chapter 8, verse 12, Israel thinks of God as a stranger. As a stranger. That's very instructive for us on a side note. The moment you begin to love other things or other ones above God, God will be a stranger to you. He will be a stranger to you. You never want to let that happen. You never want to let that happen. But Israel has. And so they have loved everyone else opposed to God. They have committed the most flagrant and the most rampant spiritual adultery. And so there is only one outcome. There is only one just punishment. What must God do? According to the law, according to what is righteous and just, he must kill them. And that's exactly what he says in Hosea chapter 10, verses 13 through 15. I will crush even your women and children on the rocks. You will die. This is the right thing to do. And so we see a pattern. Israel commits spiritual adultery, and there is only one outcome to this adultery. It is the just punishment according to the law. It is the just punishment according to God's character, and that is death. God must execute and kill Israel. And it is at this point that we see how God's love goes so much further beyond what we can imagine or think. Because normally in this situation, death does us part. When you die, the relationship is over. But God says, this is where marriage cannot be used to be an analogy between my relationship with you, Israel. Because even though I will kill you, I will raise you up in the end so that we will love each other. Death will not separate us. My love is far too strong and powerful and determined for that. In Hosea chapter 6, at the end of the first section that deals with the internals of God's relationship with Israel, listen to the wording of Hosea chapter 6, verse 2. Here's what it says. On the second day, he will make us live again. On the third day, he will raise us up. Why does God have to revive or make Israel live again? Why does he have to raise them up? Because they're dead. Why? Because he killed them. Why? Because they had to be executed for their adultery. But God says, but I will resurrect them. I will resurrect them even on the third day. And you start thinking, resurrection and the third day? Well, that sounds familiar. I know somebody who did that. Yes, Sunday school answer, Jesus. Jesus did that. And the third day is not a coincidence. It's not like God had a scheduling dilemma and he knew he had to do something on Sunday and he wanted some things to happen on Friday, so the only way you can make it work is just having 3 days, give or take a little bit. That wasn't God. It wasn't coincidental. It wasn't accidental. It was always God's design. God said, I'll raise him up on the third day to tell you that I love him and I love his people, those in him, the exact same way. This love demonstrated in Hosea 6 is not fictional. It is a fact. It is the way God has achieved such love. But God doesn't just say this once. He doesn't just say it at the end of that first section dealing with the internals. Again, we know that there's an internal section and an external section. And in the same way that he concluded the first section with a hopeful message, he will conclude the second way with a bold proclamation: death shall not do us part. In Hosea 11 through 13, and this really dovetails into the verses that we're covering to this morning, but in Hosea 11, God says, I can't give up Israel. I love them too much. And in fact, in Hosea 12, God says, I love them in the past. I love them when they were just Jacob, and I love them in the Exodus. I love them then. I even love them in the present. I love them right now. And even though I must judge them, notice what it says in chapter 13, verse 14. Compassion will be hidden from my sight. God knows he has to judge them now. They must be executed for their sins. If Israel was loved by God in the past, and if God loved Israel in the present, don't you think he's going to love them in the future? And that's exactly what Hosea 13 verse 14 is talking about. God says to Israel, even as they are about to die, this is not the end. I will love you forever, and nothing will separate me from you, and I will have you in the end, because my love is determined to overcome everything so that we will have each other in the end. That is what Hosea 13, verse 14 in context is talking about. Yes, this verse talks about the resurrection, but it doesn't just talk about the resurrection. It talks about the resurrection relative to showing that it is the expression of how deep and how far God's love will go. It demonstrates and is the proof, the definitive proof of the perfection of God's love, so that Israel, who at this time was doubting whether they had a God of love, would know our God has the highest form of love. Because even man, at his best day, in his best capacity, has this marital love, and it is amazing, but it's death do us part. But our God's love trumps all of that, because death shall never do us part. He has the most supreme love of all. And Hosea 13 verse 14 expresses the perfection of such love in two ways. In two ways. And that's what I'd like to focus on this morning. Two ways that the perfection of God's love is seen via the resurrection, as seen in Hosea 13, verse 14. Two ways. And with that in mind, let's talk about the first way, which is found in the first half of verse 14. And that is this: how deep the love of God is. How deep the love of God is. God asks two questions in the first part of verse 14. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? And the first thing we notice is, indeed, God has asked questions. And we have to ask our own question, which is, why? Is God indecisive? Does he not know what to do? That's why he's asking the question. Does he need help deciding? Why does God ask these questions? Asking questions of these kind are important. They remind us that God doesn't have to do this. This is optional. And also, it reminds us not to oversimplify God's love. That there's a lot more involved and entailed and included than at first glance. It reminds me, the logic of these questions, of what happens sometimes at a dinner table. And to clarify, my kids are not too guilty of this, but I can imagine that at some dinner tables, it happens this way. Mom, why do we have to eat this? I don't want to eat this for dinner. And at that point, the parent might say, do you really think it's easy for me to cook this healthy, delicious meal? Do you really think it's easy to go grocery shopping in grocery stores and endure that just so that you can have a good meal and spend all that money that could be spent on all kinds of other things just so that you have quality ingredients? And do you think it's easy to cook and to clean? Do you think all of that is just so simple and I have to do that for you? Now, if the child has not tuned out at this point, they will realize Mom and Dad don't have to do that. And there's a lot involved. There's a lot involved. It wasn't easy. And in the same way, God asks these questions to remind us, I don't have to love you like this. I don't have to. There's nothing that says I have to do it this way. And never oversimplify my love for you. It's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more involved than what it looks. And that is definitely the case when we consider all that God is considering. You see, the first question God asks in this first point is, should I pay the ultimate price? Should I pay the ultimate price? Notice the first phrase, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? The word ransom consistently means to buy. It means to buy someone out. It denotes the price paid to free someone, say from slavery or any obligation. It always stresses price. It always stresses the cost. It always stresses sacrifice. And since we have been talking about marriage in this context, marriage is filled with sacrifice. And we can point out to some trivial ones, like sometimes couples struggle with toothpaste and because they like rolling it up from the bottom to the top or from the middle up. And so they can't ever agree. And either they sacrifice for each other by just compromising, or they just buy 2 tubes of toothpaste and sacrifice financially that way for each other. And we can chuckle about miniature sacrifices, but we also know there are massive sacrifices in marriage. And we think of the ailing spouse and a spouse that is by his or her side every single day, nurturing and caring. We say, that's beautiful. That's amazing. That is an example of this driving, faithful, delivering kind of love that God has. This is wonderful. Indeed it is. But it falls short. It falls short. Because the sacrifice we're looking at in verse 14 is not of that category. What does God say? Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? This is not even about toothpaste, nor about even daily sacrifice. This is something far more ultimate. The word Sheol consistently has the idea of the afterlife because it fundamentally, and sometimes has negative overtones, because fundamentally it denotes separation. Separation. That when you are in the afterlife, you are not in this life to see what God is doing in this life, in His plan, with His presence, with His promises to achieve His blessings in this world. You are separated from Him and that positive presence and blessing and purpose. And so Sheol is viewed negatively that way because it deals with separation. This is the very reason why we want a physical bodily resurrection, because we want to be part of God's positive presence and His blessings that He has made and His agenda to make all things right in this world. That is why we care about a physical bodily resurrection, because God will win on every level, and we want to know that and experience that. And God, in His love, will facilitate that. Nevertheless, Sheol then denotes separation. Separation from that. And the power of Sheol is the ability of the hand, so to speak, of Sheol to keep you there, to keep you separated. And we understand that death separates. We really do. And it doesn't just take a Christian to understand this. Everyone understands this. That's why, after all, it is till death do us part. Because we recognize that death separates. And people do anything at times to keep them from being separated, to prevent that from happening. And the pagan sometimes, even after death, tries to bridge that separation, doing very, very dangerous and wicked things, whether that be in the occult or spiritists or mediums or the whatnot, to try to bridge that separation, but they can't. There is nothing you have that you can give, no price you can pay to bridge that divide. It's simply not possible. But God can. God can. That's why He's asking the question, shall I pay the price to ransom them from Sheol? Should I pay that price to reconcile man with myself, to bridge that separation, to bring us back together again? And when you talk about bridging that separation and reconciliation, then this question, shall I ransom them from Sheol? It is a gospel question, is it not? That is what it's going to take to reconcile man to God, to overcome death in that way. It is going to take the gospel, the truths of the gospel. And so here's God's question then. Should I pay the ultimate price? What is that price? Should I send my son? the Son that I love, that I have eternally and perfectly loved, should I send him in whom my soul delights and have him slaughtered in front of my eyes and have him face the shame and my own wrath and endure all of that on my beloved Son? Should I have him executed in front of my own eyes just so you would live? Do I pay that price? And with that question, God reminds us the resurrection's not easy. It's not like he just flicks a switch and it's done. It's going to cost him something. It's going to cost him everything. And there will be the pain of searing loss. Does he love you that much to endure all of that? Yes, he does. And that shows us that the resurrection reflects the depth of God's love, because it shows us that God will sacrifice more than what we even have to give. Did you hear that? God will sacrifice more than what we even have to give. We don't even possess our own, what God gives up. And so God, in a sense, loses or pays out more than what we could ever comprehend. And that is the depth of God's love. He does really pay the ultimate price. But that's not all he does. The second question of this first half of the verse shows us that he exerts not only the ultimate price, but the ultimate power. The ultimate power. Notice the next phrase. Shall I redeem them from death? Shall I redeem them from death? The word redeem denotes power. It denotes tenacity. In Exodus 6:16, God says that with an outstretched arm, he redeemed Israel by many signs and wonders. And so what we have is the omnipotence of God unleashed and revealed as plague after plague after plague. He just humbles and levels out Egypt so that he would free his people. That's power and tenacity. In fact, we see this even in Deuteronomy 19, the avenger of blood, or the redeemer of blood, one who would pursue a murderer to make sure that justice is done. And so the idea of redeem, at least in Hebrew, denotes to do whatever it takes to make something right, to do whatever it takes to save. And we have that kind of power and tenacity in marriage and in romantic love. It reminds me of this one time when someone paid an airline pilot to write in the sky, "I love you, will you marry me?" I mean, this is a message from heaven, and this person is desiring to communicate that. How lovely. Now, to be fair and to be totally honest, there was a miscommunication that happened then, and the airline pilot wrote that message in the wrong part of the sky, a part of the sky that was blocked by buildings in the skyline. So when the guy took the girl up to show her the message, she couldn't see a thing and they broke up. But it was a really good thought. It was a really good thought. But no matter what feat we're talking about in marriage, we're looking at some power, some feat, some tenacity that goes beyond all of that, because what is God asking? Shall I redeem them from death? And death is powerful. In Awana, sometimes I ask the Awana kids, who's your hero? What heroes do you guys have? And they'll list all these superheroes from comic books and video games and movies and television. And I say, and they all die, right? And the kids stop and they say, yeah. Then they're not heroes. They're dead. They're not that powerful. And all the kids look at me as if I've just ruined their childhood. Death is powerful. And we know that. We know that. That's why we are desperate. We are sometimes at our wits' end to try to save someone's life, the life of one we love. We want that so much, but we are helpless. We cannot take death on. But God can. That's why he's asking the question, shall I redeem them from death? With that, God is asking the question, do I do everything in my power to pursue and love these people? Do I love them that much? And I think we know the answer to that question. Absolutely yes. And with that, God proclaims, I will pursue these people, and nothing will stop me, because I will do whatever it takes to fight for you, to make sure that we love each other in the end. And even if it means I have to move heaven and earth, life and death itself, I will do so. And if death stands in my way, I will overcome death. I will redeem you from death. I will take death out so that we love each other in the end, because all of God's being and all of his might is for you. That is what this verse, that is what this phrase is communicating. In context, Israel's about to die, and God is telling them at this moment, you have to understand, Israel, this is not the end. This is not the way it ends. I will never let you go. Even now, I will not let you go. I will save you, and I will overcome even this so that we will have a perfect relationship in the end. And that is the supernatural power of the love of God. That is the supernatural power of the love of God. How deep is the love of God? You could put it this way. The resurrection proves that God will fight for you in a way you just cannot do. God will fight for you. He will do whatever it takes for you in a way that you simply cannot do. So in the first half of this verse, we see that the resurrection shows us the depth of God's love. By asking these questions, Hosea reminds us, never oversimplify God's love. It wasn't easy. It wasn't effortless. Rather, this cost God something. The resurrection demanded immense sacrifice of searing loss. And on top of that, it demanded him to demonstrate and display his omnipotent power and to relentlessly pursue his people even beyond death. That's what is involved in the love of God per the resurrection. Put it this way, if God has to sacrifice that which you don't have, and he fights for you in a way that you cannot, then he simply loves you in a way you cannot do. He simply loves you in a way you cannot. We don't even have the capacity, the ability to love like this. We simply don't. And that proves, does it not, that marriage is deficient, because it doesn't have that ultimate love. There's a limit, but God's love goes beyond that. That's how deep it is. But it's not just how deep God's love is, it's also, and here is the second part of this verse, and therefore the second way that the resurrection shows God's love, it is how far it will go. It's not just how deep it is, but how far it will go. And the latter half of verse 14 shows that to us. God asks, O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, where is your sting? And these questions are a little bit different than the previous questions. These questions are a taunt. They're mockery. Death, do your worst. Bring it on. It shows God's determination to fulfill. It shows how far he will go. Well, how far will he go? Well, first of all, we see that God's love provides the ultimate protection. God's love provides the ultimate protection. O death, where are your thorns? The word thorns can be translated like plagues. It consistently denotes a mortal illness, something that is lethal, always effective, always deadly. And therefore, death's thorns, or its plagues, is a weapon that death wields that always will kill you and keep you dead. 100% effective. And we know of that kind of power, and we know of that kind of terror that death can bring. That's why when our loved ones are struggling with life, we want to be by their side. We want to take care of them. And we never want them to feel alone. And we never want them to be abandoned. And we want to protect them from anything that could harm them. We wish for that. But ultimately, we can't fulfill that. We can't shield them from death. We can't go with them there. We know that, but we wish. We wish that was the case. But what does God say? Death, bring it on. Bring it on. In fact, God doesn't just say bring it on. Notice, death, where are your thorns? Do you see that is in the plural, not the singular? Everywhere else in the Old Testament, it's in the singular. Why? Because you only need one plague. You only need one thorn to kill. It's a 100% effective weapon. But God says, death, bring out your whole arsenal. Unload everything. Unleash everything. Do your absolute worst. Bring it all on. Why? Because God says, I will be there for my people. And I will shield them from everything you have. I will protect them and I will bear that. And they will never be alone. And they will never be abandoned. Because I will be there right there for them. So that death will be negated. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean you won't die or that you won't feel pain or suffer. But this does mean that death's lethality, its mortality, all that makes death truly death, is mitigated by God. And God shields us from that. Put it this way. Sometimes when we have a cut or a cold, we tell ourselves, or we might tell someone else, hey, it's going to be okay. It's not like you're going to die. With that, we understand that there is a type of pain and a type of anguish and a type of loneliness associated with death. It is in its own category, and God bore that. He shielded us from all of that so that it is not death to die. It is not death to die. How far does God's love go? Here's what Hosea reminds us. God's love goes where we wish our love could go. God's love goes where we wish our love could go. We wish we could do this. God says, I did it. I did it for you. That's the power and the beauty of God's love. But there's something that undergirds all of this. There is something that undergirds all of this, and that is that God not only will go to be our protection, God will go all the way to be our propitiation. To be our propitiation. That's the final phrase of this verse. O Sheol, where is your sting? Your sting. The word sting is consistently every single time in the Old Testament associated with God's wrath, his punishment against sin. In Deuteronomy 32, it talks about God's wrath. In Isaiah 28, it talks about wrath. In Psalm 91, it talks about God's judgment. Always, 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 this word denotes God's just punishment against disobedience, against wickedness and sin. And it is God's wrath that makes Sheol so terrible. It is God's wrath that makes death so terrible. Paul even acknowledges this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Why? Because that incites the wrath of God. And in marriage, no one even conceives of reversing death and bearing another person's sin. You don't write that into your vows. It's not even an option because it doesn't even exist. You don't even think about, well, what to get honey for your anniversary? Maybe I can buy her some atonement. You don't think that way. That's ridiculous. Why? Because it just can't be done. It's so removed. It's so non-existent as a possibility, we don't even entertain it. It's unimaginable. But what does God say? Bring it on. Where is it? Where is it? Where is the sting? Bring it on. I will bear my own wrath so that death will be reversed. And God says, even if it takes going through life and death and even hell on a cross so that we will love each other in the end, I will do that. How far does God's love go? Let's put it this way. It goes all the way. It goes all the way. Not just what you wish you could do. It goes all the way of what must be done so that we would love each other forever. There is nothing God has not done to love us. And that's the immensity of his love. Death shall not do us part. So we see that the resurrection shows the supremacy of God's love. We see that it's deep, and we see how far God will go. We see that he sacrifices and he fights for us, and he will protect us, and he will even be our propitiation. This is the immensity of God's love. He does more than we can ask or imagine. He goes beyond the limits of what we have in marriage. And so now at this point, some might say, what a lovely poem. What a great hyperbole and metaphor. Maybe it's a little bit exaggerated about God's love. Not so. Not true. How do we know that? How do we know that God established that he loves us exactly this way? Christ's resurrection. That's the proof. The text has already declared it, and Christ's resurrection further proves it. Why? Because he rose on the third day, exactly what Hosea 6 said. And this verse in Hosea 13 becomes Paul's theology in 1 Corinthians 15 of the resurrection. This is the very nature of the resurrection. This is exactly the way it happens. And therefore, this is the nature of God's love. Why? Because he exactly did this in Christ, and therefore will do exactly this for us in the end. God at this moment declares to us, marriage, your love as human beings, we can experience it and we can know it in all its beauty and all its grandeur. And we should experience that because it does honor God and it does honor the gospel and proclaim that. But as we do that, we have to realize, as great and immense that is, his love is still more. Because death will not do us part with him. With that, brothers and sisters, marriage is the highest form of human love. And in a culture that assaults marriage and is confused and rebels against marriage, we need to have clarity and we need to champion and understand marriage so that in the end, we understand we have a God of ultimate love. Of ultimate love. After all, God's love sacrifices more. He fights for us harder. He protects us. And he does more than what we can ever imagine. Goes all the way for us. That is his unique love, categorically above all other loves in this entire universe. And so we need to exalt in a God who, contrary to our culture, is not clueless about love. He's not clueless. He knows love perfectly, not only in how he designed marriage, but in how he loves us. In how he loves us. Because unlike marriage, where death does us part, God's love is so passionate, so relentless, so eternal, so dedicated, that death will never do us part. Shall we pray? Oh God, may we leave this place with a conviction that your love is above all else. And therefore you are the most glorious, and you are the most definitive, and you are deserving of all praise and worship. And that we should love you, for you have so first loved us. May we understand the spectacular splendor and the categorical otherness of your love, so that we would worship you and love the Son in whom we have the resurrection. For his honor and for his glory do we pray. Amen.